My name is Daniel Mercer. I am a seasonal fire lookout assigned to Tower 17, a remote structure standing alone above a vast stretch of protected woodland that most people will never enter, and fewer still will ever truly understand. I am writing this as a record, not a confession, because what happened during my final shift cannot be explained through superstition or imagination. Everything I describe occurred within a single day, measured by the same clock mounted above my desk, ticking steadily, even when time itself began to feel unreliable. I accepted the assignment because I wanted isolation. That is the official language I used in my application, and it was accurate. I had served in busier districts before. Crowded stations, overlapping radio chatter, constant oversight. But Tower 17 offered silence, autonomy, and responsibility without interference. The structure itself is an aging square, cabin elevated on steel legs, accessible only by a narrow trail and a final ladder climb. From the cab, I could see miles of uninterrupted forest canopy, broken only by rock outcroppings and the occasional scar of an old logging road long since reclaimed by growth. On my first morning there, the briefing materials were minimal: fire behavior charts, weather protocols, radio call signs, emergency procedures, all standard. What stood out was a single page at the back of the packet, unnumbered, typed in the same font as the rest, but without an official header. It was titled Operational Guidelines Supplemental. I assumed it covered quirks specific to the tower. It did not read like any guideline I had encountered before. The language was formal, restrained, and oddly precise. It did not reference myths or legends. It did not explain origins. It simply listed practices that were expected to be followed without deviation. The word rules was never used, but the intent was unmistakable. Certain paths were not to be acknowledged after dusk. Certain lights were not to be counted. If voices were heard below the tree line, radio contact was not to be initiated unless a visual confirmation of a person was made first. Most unsettling of all, I was instructed that if I became disoriented while remaining inside the tower, I was to sit down immediately and wait for clarity to return. I remember rereading that line several times, wondering how someone could become lost inside a room smaller than most kitchens. I rationalized it the same way I had rationalized every strange policy I had seen in government work. Someone, somewhere, had learned the hard way. The document did not frighten me. It annoyed me. I placed it back in the folder and began my shift. The day progressed normally at first. Clear skies, mild wind, visibility excellent. I conducted my scheduled sweeps, marking bearings and scanning for smoke. The forest looked peaceful from above, a continuous green surface that hid its depth and complexity. Radio check-ins came and went. I made coffee on the small propane burner and ate a late breakfast while listening to the wind brush the tower's metal supports. The first deviation was so minor I almost missed it. At 11:42 a.m., I noticed a thin column of pale gray rising far to the northwest. It was faint, inconsistent, and dispersed quickly, but it was enough to warrant a longer look. I logged the bearing and continued monitoring. 10 minutes later, the smoke was gone. No reports came in from other towers. I noted it as a false alarm: dust, fog burn off, or controlled activity beyond the boundary. At 12:30 p.m., it appeared again. Same location, same behavior. This time, I radioed it in. The response was delayed, then brief. No activity reported. I was told to continue observation. The voice on the other end sounded tired, uninterested, as if I had interrupted something more important. Shortly after that exchange, I became aware of a sensation I can only describe as pressure. Not physical discomfort, but an awareness that the space around me had grown denser. Sounds carried differently. The wind no longer moved uniformly. It came in uneven pulses, causing the tower to creak in patterns that felt deliberate rather than random. I stood near the windows, turning slowly, checking each quadrant again. That was when I saw the trail from the tower. The access path is visible for about 100 yards before it disappears into the trees. I had walked it that morning. I knew exactly where it bent, where the undergrowth thickened, where a fallen log lay parallel to the ground. What I saw now did not match that memory. The trail appeared straighter, wider, cleared in a way it had not been before. I assumed fatigue, visual distortion. I looked away, checked my instruments, then looked back. The trail remained altered. It did not look new. It looked intentional, as if it had always been that way, and my memory was the thing that was wrong. I opened the supplemental guidelines again, flipping through them with growing irritation, searching for something relevant. My eyes stopped on a line I had skimmed earlier. Paths may present themselves differently under observation. Trust previous knowledge. Do not investigate discrepancies. That was the moment the forest made its first request of me. The radio crackled once. Not a call, just static, brief and sharp. Then silence. I waited for a follow-up that never came. When I checked the unit, it was still powered, still tuned, still functional. I tried a routine call. No response. Outside, the forest canopy shifted as if something had passed beneath it. Too large to see clearly, too distant to identify, but close enough to disturb the pattern of leaves. The movement did not travel in a straight line. It circled. I sat down. The clock above my desk read 1:07 p.m. I stayed seated for several minutes, forcing my breathing to slow, reminding myself that isolation amplifies perception. That was when I noticed the smell. Not smoke. Not decay. Something dry and old, like paper stored too long in a sealed space. It did not come from any direction. It simply existed. When I stood again, the trail below the tower was gone. Not obscured, not hidden by shadow. Gone entirely. Replaced by uninterrupted forest floor that sloped naturally as if no path had ever cut through it. My stomach tightened, but I did not panic. I remembered the instruction. Trust previous knowledge. I did not radio it in. I did not mark it in the log. I told myself that whatever rules governed this place, they were not interested in immediate harm. Not yet. The forest was watching, and I had not broken the agreement. The clock above my desk moved forward without hesitation. 1:18 p.m. The second hand swept cleanly, evenly, as if nothing in the world had shifted. That detail mattered more to me than I was willing to admit at the time. As long as time behaved normally, I believed I still had leverage. Whatever the forest was doing, it was happening within rules I hadn't fully learned yet. But rules nonetheless. I forced myself back into routine. I logged weather conditions. I checked humidity. I wrote notes about visibility, even though I no longer trusted what my eyes were telling me. The act of writing grounded me. Ink on paper felt permanent in a way the view outside no longer did. At 1:36 p.m., the trail reappeared. Not gradually. Not as if revealed by shifting light. It was simply there again, exactly as I remembered it from the morning. Narrow. Uneven. Slightly overgrown at the edges. The fallen log was back in place, its bark split in the same familiar pattern. If I had not watched it disappear myself, I would have believed it had never left. I did not feel relief. I felt observed. That sensation intensified when I noticed movement at the edge of the tree line. A figure stood where the trail vanished into the woods. At first, I thought it was a hiker who had strayed off established routes. That assumption lasted only long enough for my brain to register the lack of detail. The shape was human in proportion but indistinct, as though distance alone could erase features at that range. It did not wave. It did not step forward. It simply stood, angled toward the tower. The supplemental guidelines had been explicit about voices, not shapes. Nothing in the document prohibited visual acknowledgement. Still, something about the way the figure held its posture made my skin tighten. It wasn't waiting. It was positioning itself. I lifted the binoculars, hesitated, then lowered them again. The guidelines had warned against counting lights, responding to voices, investigating paths. They had not mentioned optics, but the intent was clear enough. Engagement was a form of consent. I watched with my unaided eyes, careful not to focus too sharply. The figure remained for less than a minute. Then it stepped backward, not deeper into the forest, but sideways, slipping between trees without disturbing branches or undergrowth. The canopy closed behind it. Nothing moved afterward. I checked the radio again. Dead air. At 2:02 p.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. The metal steps beneath the tower are exposed and unforgiving. Wind makes them groan. Animals make irregular sounds when they brush against them. Human footsteps are unmistakable. These were steady, measured, evenly spaced. Someone was climbing up to the cab. I stood frozen in the center of the room, heart pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. Every protocol I knew told me to announce myself, to establish contact, to prepare for assistance or confrontation. The supplemental guidelines said nothing about visitors during daylight hours, but the silence of the radio told me this was not a normal interaction. The footsteps stopped one level below the cab. I waited. The smell returned, stronger now, filling the enclosed space until it felt thick enough to taste. My eyes watered slightly, not from irritation, but from instinctive response. The way the body reacts to something it doesn't recognize as safe. A shadow passed across the frosted lower window. Slow, deliberate, I did not move. After several seconds, the shadow withdrew. The footsteps resumed, this time descending. I listened until they faded completely, counting each step without realizing I was doing it, until I reached 32. That was how many there should have been. That detail unsettled me more than if the count had been wrong. At 20:19 p.m., the radio crackled again. Tower 17, a voice said. Calm. Familiar. We missed your last check-in. I almost answered immediately. Muscle memory nearly overrode caution. I stopped myself just in time, forcing my hand away from the microphone. The voice sounded right. The call sign was correct. The cadence matched the dispatcher I had spoken to earlier. But the guidelines had been clear. No response without visual confirmation. When voices originate from below the tree line, this voice came from everywhere. From nowhere. I'm here. It continued, after a pause that felt measured. Signal's been acting up all day. You still seeing that smoke? I sat down. The clock read 2:21 p.m. I waited, staring at the wall, grounding myself in the shape of the room. 4 walls, 1 desk, 1 cot, 1 stove. I focused on what could not change. The voice waited with me, patient, unpressured. When I did not respond, it did not repeat itself. It simply stopped. The silence afterward was profound. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. The forest had asked again, more directly this time, and I had refused. The pressure eased slightly, like a held breath released. By mid-afternoon, the light began to shift. Shadows lengthened across the canopy, and the quality of the air changed. I could feel the day narrowing, closing in toward evening. I knew, without knowing how, that whatever rules governed this place became less forgiving after sunset. At 3:04 p.m., I noticed the first light. It was deep in the forest, far beyond the trail, a small steady glow between the trees. Not flickering, not moving, just present. It was the color of a lantern flame seen through fog. My eyes were drawn to it instinctively, and with that came a memory of the guideline I had not wanted to remember. Do not count the lights. I looked away immediately, heart racing. The light did not vanish. It remained in my peripheral vision, steady and insistent. When I risked another glance, I saw that there was more than one now. 2, maybe 3, spaced irregularly, at different depths. I did not count them. Instead, I closed the blinds. The interior of the tower darkened, shutting out the forest entirely. For the first time since morning, I felt something like control return. I turned on the overhead light and sat at the desk, hands trembling slightly as I wrote everything down. Not for reporting, for memory, for proof. The clock ticked on. 3:17 p.m. I had the overwhelming sense that the forest was waiting for night, and that I had already used up more leniency than most. The blinds stayed closed, but darkness found its way in regardless. It seeped through the seams around the windows, thin lines of fading daylight stretching across the floor like narrow paths I refused to follow. The overhead light hummed softly, steady but weak, and I became aware of how small its reach truly was. Everything beyond the center of the room felt distant, unreal, as if the edges of the tower were receding from me. I checked the clock again. 3:29 p.m. Time was still behaving. That was my anchor. I told myself that as long as the hours moved forward in the right order, nothing irreversible had happened yet. I focused on small tasks, reorganizing the desk, checking battery levels, reading weather notes. Anything to keep my mind from drifting outward, toward the forest I could no longer see. The silence broke with a sound so subtle, I almost dismissed it. Something brushed the underside of the tower. Not a collision, not an impact. A contact, light and exploratory, like fingers running along the bottom of a table. The steel supports vibrated faintly, sending a shiver through the floorboards. I froze listening. Wind could not do that. Animals rarely lingered beneath the tower, and when they did, their movements were erratic, impatient. This was careful. The brushing sound moved, circling the base of the structure once, then twice. I could track it by vibration alone. The way the metal responded differently, depending on which support was touched. When it completed the second circuit, it stopped directly beneath the ladder. I held my breath. The ladder rattled once, just enough to be intentional. I did not look. The guidelines had not said anything about ladders, but they had said enough about acknowledgement. I stayed seated, eyes fixed on the blank wall ahead of me, forcing myself not to react. The ladder rattled again, then went still. I waited for footsteps, for the scrape of boots on metal, for anything that would signal ascent. Nothing came. Instead, the smell intensified. Dry. Old. Pressing into my lungs with every breath. My throat tightened, not from fear but from a deep, instinctive rejection. Like inhaling air from a place that had been sealed too long. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and focused on breathing slowly through my nose. Minutes passed. The ladder remained untouched. When the pressure finally lifted, it did so abruptly, like a hand withdrawing. The vibration stopped. The smell thinned until it was barely perceptible again. I checked the clock. 3:51 p.m. I stood and cracked the blinds open, just enough to see the sky. The sun was lower now, angled sharply, staining the canopy in deep gold and shadow. The forest looked normal again. Too normal. No lights, no figures. The trail was visible, unchanged. That normalcy unsettled me more than the disturbances had. At 4:06 p.m., the radio came back to life. Tower 17, the dispatcher said. Different voice this time. Younger? Will lost you for a bit. Everything good up there? I scanned the horizon quickly, looking for any sign of movement near the tree line. I saw nothing. The voice came cleanly through the speaker. No distortion, no echo. It sounded like it belonged in a control room, not the woods. I hesitated. The guideline echoed in my head, precise and unforgiving. No response without visual confirmation when voices originate from below the tree line. This voice felt distant, elevated, carried through infrastructure rather than forest. That distinction mattered. I believed it mattered. I pressed the button. Tower 17 reporting. I said, keeping my tone even. Had some intermittent signal issues. Visibility remains clear. No confirmed smoke. The response came instantly. Copy that. Glad you're back with us. Relief washed through me. Sudden and almost overwhelming. The forest had not taken the radio. Whatever rules governed this place, they had allowed that line to remain intact. I logged the exchange carefully, noting the time. The voice changed, the clarity. As I set the pen down, I realized my hands were shaking. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but the absence of disturbance did not bring peace. It felt like a pause rather than a resolution, as if the forest was allowing me to rest before something more demanding. Shadows stretched further, swallowing the lower reaches of the trees until the ground itself disappeared into darkness. At 5:12 p.m., the lights returned. They were closer now. I saw them clearly through the open blinds, glowing softly between the trunks. No longer deep in the forest, but approaching the outer edge of the clearing below the tower. They did not flicker. They did not sway. They held their positions with unnatural precision, each one occupying a space that felt deliberate. I closed the blinds halfway, leaving just enough of a gap to monitor the sky. The lights remained visible at the edges of my vision, persistent, tempting. My mind wanted to quantify them, to impose order, to count. I resisted with everything I had. The radio crackled once, then stayed silent. At 5:28 p.m., I heard voices. Not from the radio. They rose from the forest below, faint at first, then clearer, layered over one another in overlapping murmurs. I couldn't make out words, only cadence, the rise and fall of human speech, stripped of meaning. It sounded like a conversation overheard through walls, intimate and close without being directed at me. I backed away from the windows, heart hammering. The voices did not call my name. They did not ask for help. They simply spoke, as if the tower were not there at all. I sat down. The clock read 5:31 p.m. I waited, eyes closed, grounding myself in the feel of the chair beneath me, the rough grain of the desk under my fingertips. The voices continued for several minutes, then faded together into a single sustained whisper that raised the hairs on my arms. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I opened my eyes. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the last of the sunlight slipped below the horizon. Night settled over the forest completely, swift and final. I understood then that the rules had shifted. Daylight had been a buffer, a grace period. The forest had tested me gently, while the sun was still up. Gauging how closely I would adhere to the agreement I had unknowingly entered when I accepted the assignment. Now that night had fallen. The expectations were different, more personal. I logged the time carefully. 5:47 p.m. The first star appeared above the canopy, sharp and cold. Somewhere below, something moved through the darkness, slow and confident, unbothered by the loss of light. I stayed still, aware with sudden clarity that the forest was no longer observing me from a distance. It was close enough now to listen. Night did not arrive gradually. It settled in layers, each one heavier than the last, until the forest below the tower became a single uninterrupted mass of black. The canopy swallowed depth and distance alike. Without the horizon, the world felt closer, compressed, as if the woods were pressing inward from all sides. I kept the blinds half drawn, enough to watch the sky, enough to remind myself that something still existed beyond the walls. The lights in the forest remained, steady and patient, positioned just far enough apart that my eyes wanted to connect them into patterns. I refused to let them. I focused instead on the stars overhead, sparse and sharp, immune to whatever rules governed the ground. The clock read 6:02 p.m. I ate dinner standing up, forcing myself to chew slowly. Even my appetite had vanished. Every sound seemed amplified now. The scrape of the spoon against the can, the soft click of the stove knob, the whisper of my own breath. I cleaned up immediately, not out of neatness but necessity. Disorder felt dangerous. Anything left unfinished felt like an invitation. When I sat back down at the desk, the radio came alive again. This time, there was no call sign, just breathing. It was faint, irregular, like someone trying to stay quiet. I stared at the speaker, my pulse thudding in my throat. The guidelines were unambiguous about this. Breathing through an unpowered radio had been mentioned once, briefly, almost as an aside. If it occurred, the instruction was simple: disconnect the unit. I stood, crossed the room, and pulled the power cable free. The speaker went silent immediately. I waited, counting seconds in my head, half expecting the sound to continue anyway. It did not. The radio was dead. I left it that way. The relief was short-lived. A knock came from below. Not on the door, on the tower itself. A dull, hollow sound that reverberated through the steel supports. One knock, then another, slow, evenly spaced. As if someone were testing the structure's integrity. I did not move. The knocking traveled upward, moving from support to support, circling the tower the same way the brushing had earlier. When it reached the ladder, it stopped. The silence stretched, taut and deliberate. I could feel it in my teeth, in the base of my skull. The ladder creaked. I squeezed my eyes shut and sat down hard in the chair, hands gripping the armrests. The ladder creaked again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of weight being applied. Something was climbing. I kept my eyes closed. The guidelines had warned me about disorientation inside the tower. They had told me to sit and wait if it happened. This felt adjacent to that warning, close enough that I trusted the intent, if not the letter. I focused on the clock's ticking, on the steady hum of the overhead light, on the familiar geometry of the room. The ladder stopped. No footsteps on the landing, no hand on the door, just stillness. I opened my eyes. Nothing had changed. The door remained closed. The room was exactly as I had left it. For several seconds, I allowed myself to believe that whatever had climbed the ladder had left again without testing the threshold. Then I noticed the shadow beneath the door. It was wrong. The light inside the tower should have cast a clean, rectangular line under the door. What I saw instead was uneven, broken by shapes that suggested movement just beyond the frame. Something stood on the other side, close enough to block the light but not close enough to touch the door. A voice spoke, not loud, not pleading, calm and conversational. "You don't have to sit in the dark," it said. "We can see you just fine." My mouth went dry. The voice did not sound like it was coming through the door. It sounded like it was already in the room, speaking from behind me, from beside me, from everywhere at once. I did not respond. The shadow shifted, resolving briefly into something taller than a person, then flattening again. The door handle turned slowly, testing resistance. It did not open. The lock held. Rules are flexible. The voice continued. "They always are. You've already bent a few." I thought of the radio, of the moment I had answered, of the binoculars I had lifted and lowered. The forest had been keeping score. "I just want to talk," the voice said. "You're alone up there. That's not how it's meant to be." I pressed my lips together, fighting the urge to scream, to shout, to do anything that would break the silence. The guidelines had never mentioned doors, but the principle was consistent. Engagement was permission. Minutes passed. The voice did not repeat itself. It waited. When the pressure became unbearable, it lifted all at once. The shadow withdrew. The door handle returned to its resting position. The sounds on the ladder reversed, descending slowly until they faded into the forest below. I checked the clock. 6:41 p.m. My entire body shook as the adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. I stayed seated, afraid to stand, afraid to move too quickly, afraid to signal that I was still paying attention. Outside, the lights shifted. They moved closer to the base of the tower, clustering near the clearing, no longer pretending to be distant. Their glow illuminated just enough of the forest floor to reveal movement, shapes passing between them, interrupting the light without fully revealing themselves. I could sense intention in the way they repositioned, as if adjusting angles, refining sightlines. At 7:03 p.m. the clock stuttered, just once. The second hand hesitated, then jumped forward, skipping a beat. The tick resumed, but the sound was different now, sharper, louder. I stared at it, heart racing, watching for another irregularity. It did not happen again. Time was still moving. I told myself that over and over, clinging to it like a mantra. The smell returned, heavier than before, filling the tower until it felt oppressive. My eyes burned. My head throbbed. With the smell came images I did not ask for. Memories of places I had never been. Paths winding through unfamiliar woods. Clearings that felt important, without knowing why. It was as if the forest were offering context, trying to make itself understood on its own terms. I pushed the chair back and stood, legs unsteady, moving carefully to the center of the room. The pressure increased immediately. A palpable weight that pressed down on my shoulders, urging me toward the windows, toward the door. I resisted. Not yet. I whispered to myself, the words barely audible. The pressure receded just slightly. At 7:26 p.m., something new appeared beneath the tower. Footprints. They emerged one by one in the dirt of the clearing, visible only where the lights allowed. Bare feet, too long, too narrow. They circled the base of the structure, overlapping in places, forming a dense pattern that made it impossible to tell where one set ended and another began. None of them led away. I backed away from the windows and sat down again, heart hammering. The forest was no longer subtle. Whatever agreement existed was approaching a breaking point, and I could feel the weight of a decision I did not fully understand bearing down on me. The clock read 7:39 p.m. Somewhere below, something shifted its weight, settling in. I had the unmistakable sense that the forest was done waiting for night to deepen. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. I stayed seated long after my legs began to ache, afraid that standing would be interpreted as intent. The footprints below the tower remained visible, only where the lights permitted, their edges softening and sharpening as the glow shifted. They never crossed into shadow. It was as if whatever made them understood precisely where it was allowed to be seen. The clock read 7:52 p.m. I picked up the supplemental guidelines again, hands trembling just enough to make the paper whisper. I had avoided reading them closely since afternoon, treating them like a superstition rather than instruction. Now they were all I had. I scanned the lines I had memorized and those I had not, searching for something, anything, that addressed this stage of the day. One passage stood out, a paragraph I had dismissed as poorly written before. Prolonged observation may prompt proximity. Proximity does not imply access. Access is granted through response, recognition, or invitation. Silence is not absence. Stillness is not surrender. I read it 3 times, letting the words settle. Access. That was the line I was walking. I had not granted it yet. Not fully. A sound rose from the forest, low and resonant. Not a voice. Not an animal. More like wind passing through a hollow space. Except the air outside was still. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, traveling up the tower's supports and into my chest. It was rhythmic, pulsing slowly, like a heartbeat too large to belong to anything human. The lights responded to it, brightening slightly in time with the pulse. I closed my eyes, counting breaths. The guidelines had not forbidden closing my eyes. They had warned about motion sensors reacting to it in other towers, but Tower 17 was old, analog, spared many modern upgrades. If I could remove sight from the equation, maybe the forest would lose leverage. It did not. Images pressed against my mind the moment I closed my eyes. Not hallucinations, not dreams, but impressions. A path through the woods that felt familiar in the way childhood homes do. A clearing ringed with stones. A sense of purpose that did not belong to me. I opened my eyes again with a sharp inhale, heart racing. The room was unchanged. The door was still closed, the light steady, the clock ticking. 18:07 p.m. The pulsing sound stopped abruptly. In its absence, the forest felt closer than ever, as if it had leaned in during the noise and remained there afterward. The lights below the tower shifted again, rearranging themselves into a loose arc facing the ladder. That was when I understood what they were waiting for. Not a mistake. A choice. I stood slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was controlled. My joints cracked softly in the quiet room, and I froze after each sound, waiting for a reaction. None came. The pressure remained constant, heavy but patient. I walked to the door. The handle was cold beneath my palm, colder than the night air should have allowed. I did not turn it. I rested my hand there, grounding myself in the reality of the barrier between inside and out. I'm staying. I said quietly, not toward the door, not toward the forest, but to the space I occupied. That's the agreement. The words felt thin as soon as they left my mouth. The forest did not respond immediately. For several seconds, nothing happened at all. Then the lights dimmed slightly, as if in consideration. Footsteps sounded below. Not climbing. Moving away. Relief surged through me, sharp and almost painful. I leaned my forehead against the door. Eyes closed, breathing hard. The guidelines had been right. Silence and stillness were not surrender. They were resistance. The relief lasted exactly 40 seconds. The radio, still unplugged, emitted a single burst of static. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The speaker was dark. The power cable lay coiled on the desk where I had left it. And yet the static continued, low and persistent, like a distant storm. A voice followed, quieter than before. "You misunderstand," it said. "We're not asking you to leave." The words crawled through the room, sliding into corners, settling into the walls. They did not echo. They absorbed. "We're asking you to stay correctly." The clock ticked louder. Each second an audible click that felt amplified beyond its mechanism. I watched the hands move, half expecting them to stop entirely. They did not. 18:19 p.m. The lights below surged brighter, illuminating the clearing fully for the first time. I could see the ground clearly now, and with it, the source of the footprints. There were no bodies attached to them. They appeared, pressed into the dirt as if by invisible weight, forming new impressions even as I watched. The ladder shook, not from climbing, from impact. Something struck the underside of the tower hard enough to rattle the entire structure. The windows buzzed faintly in their frames. I staggered, catching myself on the desk as my balance faltered. Another impact followed, closer to one of the supports, then another. The blows were methodical. Testing. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The guidelines had not mentioned structural assault, but the logic held. The tower had stood here for decades. It was part of the forest now, tolerated if not welcomed. That tolerance had limits. "Daniel," the voice said. I flinched. It was the first time it had used my name. "You know why this place works," it continued. "You know why fires stop here. Why people turn back. Why paths don't always lead where they should. Someone has to maintain that balance." Another impact. Stronger this time. I slid down into the chair, hands over my ears, fighting the urge to respond, to deny, to argue. The voice was not wrong in a way I could easily dismiss. I had seen strange patterns in fire behavior. Tower 17 before. Containment lines that held without explanation. Weather shifts that defied forecasts. I had assumed coincidence. The forest was reframing those memories now, offering context again. "You're good at following instructions," the voice said, almost approving. "That's why you're still inside." The lights flickered in unison. "You can keep doing what you're doing," it went on. "Watching. Recording. Sitting still while the night presses in. Or you can step into the role fully. Make it official." I shook my head, though no one could see it. "I didn't agree to that," I whispered. The impact stopped. Silence flooded back in, thick and heavy. The pressure intensified, compressing my chest until each breath felt like effort. The smell returned in force, overwhelming, ancient. My vision blurred at the edges as dizziness set in. The clock loomed in my vision. 18:33 p.m. time was still moving. Barely. I realized then what the final leverage was. The forest could not force access without violating its own rules. It needed consent, not through words, through action, through acknowledgement of role. I reached for the supplemental guidelines one last time, flipping to the final page. If litigation is offered, refusal must be total. Partial compliance results in disorientation, repetition, or loss. My hand shook as I set the papers down. I stood, not toward the door, toward the windows. The pressure spiked instantly, as if the forest sensed a shift. The lights below flared bright enough to cast long shadows up the tower's legs. The voice fell silent, waiting. I stopped in the center of the room. "I'm here to observe," I said, voice breaking despite my effort to keep it steady. "That's all. I don't participate. I don't intervene. I don't belong to this place." The words felt truer than anything I had said all day. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the lights dimmed. The pressure eased, just a fraction. Enough to breathe. Outside. The clearing darkened again, swallowing the footprints, erasing evidence of proximity. The forest pulled back, not retreating, but resetting distance. The clock ticked on. 8:51 p.m. I knew it wasn't over. The voice had not withdrawn its offer. It had merely accepted my refusal for now. The guidelines had warned that refusal had consequences of its own, and I could already feel them creeping in at the edges of my perception. Disorientation. Repetition. Loss. Night was far from finished with me, and the forest was patient. The forest did not surge back immediately after my refusal. That was what unsettled me most. I had expected retaliation. Escalation, something unmistakable. Instead, the night resumed a version of normalcy, so convincing that it felt rehearsed. The lights remained distant. The clearing below the tower was empty again. No footprints. No movement. The pressure that had been crushing my chest loosened, just enough to let my breathing settle into something functional. The clock read 9:04 p.m. I logged the time automatically, my pen moving on instinct while my mind lagged behind. Writing had become reflex, a way to prove continuity. Each timestamp was evidence that I had not slipped sideways into something cyclical or suspended. I checked the numbers twice to make sure they progressed forward. They did. I stood near the center of the room, afraid to sit, afraid to lie down, afraid to adopt any posture that suggested comfort. Comfort felt like complacency, and complacency felt like vulnerability. The tower creaked occasionally as the temperature dropped, metal contracting with soft, uneven groans. Each sound set my nerves on edge, but none of them carried intention. At 9:17 p.m., the radio emitted a single, sharp click. Not static, not a voice, just the sound of power reconnecting. I stared at it, pulse racing. I had not touched the cable. It remained unplugged, the end resting on the desk where I had placed it earlier. And yet the unit's indicator light flickered once, then went dark again. I approached slowly, inspecting it from a distance, as if it might move on its own if startled. The casing was unchanged, the dials unmoved. No warmth, no vibration. I did not reconnect it. Whatever had caused the click, it had not required power. I backed away, returning to the center of the room. The forest did not react. That was when the repetition began. At 9:26 p.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. The sound was identical to before. Same cadence, same spacing, same deliberate pace. I felt a sick twist of recognition as the pattern unfolded exactly as it had hours earlier. Each footfall landed where I remembered it landing before, echoing in my memory as much as in the metal supports. The steps stopped one level below the cab. I did not move. I counted my breaths. In, out. Slow. Controlled. The smell did not return this time. The pressure did not spike. The moment hung suspended as if waiting for divergence. The footsteps descended. I exhaled shakily, relief tinged with dread. The guidelines had warned me. Repetition. This was the consequence of refusal. The forest was replaying scenarios, testing whether familiarity would weaken my resolve. If I responded differently this time, if I slipped, it would count. At 9:41 p.m., the lights appeared again. Same position, same distance, same glow. I turned my chair away from the windows, refusing to give them even peripheral attention. I focused instead on the interior of the tower, cataloging objects silently. Desk, chair, cot, stove, logbook, clock. The ticking grew louder. I glanced up. The clock read 9:41 p.m. It had not moved. I stared at it, heart hammering, waiting for the second hand to jump forward, to stutter, to do anything at all. It remained fixed, frozen between seconds. The sound continued. Artificial now, disconnected from motion. Tick. I looked away, breaking eye contact the way the guidelines had taught me to do with the forest. When I looked back, the hands had advanced. 9:42 p.m. My knees nearly buckled with relief. Time was still intact. The pause had been a test, not a trap. The voices returned at 9:58 p.m. They were closer than before, no longer diffuse. Individual tones emerged from the murmur, overlapping but distinct. Male, female, yold. None of them spoke words I could understand, but the cadence suggested conversation, negotiation. Occasionally, one voice would rise slightly, as if making a point, before sinking back into the collective. I pressed my hands flat against the desk, grounding myself. I did not sit. I did not respond. I did not look toward the sound. The voices persisted for several minutes, then faded in unison, as if a decision had been reached. At 10:11 p.m., the temperature dropped sharply. Cold crept into the tower despite the sealed windows, biting at my fingers and ears. I pulled on my jacket, then another layer, but it did little to help. The cold felt internal, settling in my joints, slowing my movements. With it came fatigue, heavy and sudden, pressing down on my eyelids. Sleep would be dangerous. I knew that instinctively. The guidelines had been vague about rest after dark, but the pattern was clear. Consciousness was leverage. Attention was currency. I paced the room slowly, careful not to approach the windows or the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. My thoughts began to drift, looping back on themselves, replaying moments from earlier in the day with intrusive clarity. The smoke plume, the altered trail, the figure at the tree line. At 10:27 p.m., I realized I could no longer hear the forest. No wind, no insects, no distant movement. The silence was absolute, swallowing even the ambient creaks of the tower. My ears rang with the absence of sound. I stopped pacing. The overhead light flickered. Once, twice, it steadied again, but the damage was done. The darkness pressed closer, crowding the edges of the room. Shadows thickened unnaturally, clinging to corners and seams. A shape formed in the darkest part of the room. Not a figure. Not a body. More like an absence-given outline, a place where the light simply refused to settle. It did not move. It did not advance. It waited, occupying space without asserting presence. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall, heart pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. The shape remained where it was, patient, familiar. "You're tired," the voice said, emerging from everywhere and nowhere again. This is the part where most people give in. Not because they want to, because they can't keep the edges sharp anymore. I clenched my jaw, refusing to respond. You've done well, it continued. Better than most. But this isn't sustainable. Observation without integration leads to erosion. You're already feeling it. It was right. My thoughts were slower now. My reactions dulled. The forest wasn't threatening me anymore. It was waiting me out. The shape dissolved as gradually as it had formed, leaving the room unchanged but heavier somehow, as if it had left residue behind. At 10:49 p.m. the radio clicked again. This time, the indicator light stayed on. I stared at it in disbelief, dread flooding through me. The power cable remained disconnected. There was no rational explanation for what I was seeing, and the forest knew it. A familiar voice came through the speaker, clearer than it had ever been. Tower 17, this is dispatch. We're going to need you to step outside for a visual check. My name was not used. The tone was professional, procedural. The request was framed as routine, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened all day. I laughed. The sound startled me, sharp and brittle in the quiet room. It felt wrong in my mouth, like a foreign object. No, I said aloud, the word echoing faintly. That's not happening. There was a pause. Then the voice softened. Daniel. It said gently, you're disoriented. You've been up there too long. We can help you back down. I closed my eyes, shaking my head. The guidelines had warned me about this too. Offers of assistance. Reframing isolation as concern. Turning refusal into liability. I'm staying put, I said. That silence followed. The indicator light blinked off. The forest exhaled. The clock read 11:03 p.m. My legs trembled as the exhaustion finally began to overwhelm adrenaline. I sank into the chair despite myself, fighting to keep my eyes open. The room felt like it was tilting slightly, reality loosening at the edges. Repetition had failed. Disorientation was next, and loss, I suspected, would come last. I forced myself to stand again, gripping the desk until the dizziness passed. The forest had not won yet. It had not secured access. But the night was deepening, and my margin for error was shrinking with every passing minute. Somewhere below, something shifted position, settling in for a longer wait. I checked the clock one more time. 11:07:12 p.m. The longest hours were still ahead. By the time the clock reached 11:18 p.m., my body felt detached from intention. Every movement lagged behind thought, as if commands had to travel through something thick before reaching my limbs. I forced myself to keep moving anyway. Slow circuits of the room, measured steps, pauses only long enough to steady my breathing. Stillness invited focus, and focus invited the forest's attention. Motion, even minimal, felt like friction against whatever pressure hovered just outside the walls. The night air pressed cold against the windows. Condensation crept along the glass in thin, branching lines that reminded me uncomfortably of paths. I wiped one clear with my sleeve and immediately regretted it. Outside, the clearing looked unchanged, but the darkness carried weight now, like it had depth and texture. The stars above seemed sharper, closer, as if the sky had lowered to observe the outcome. At 11:31 p.m., the smell returned, but altered. It was no longer dry paper alone. There was soil in it now, and something green and bitter. A living smell. My stomach tightened, not from nausea but recognition. The way you recognize a place you've never visited, but somehow know. My mouth filled with saliva. My hands tingled. I leaned against the desk, breathing through my nose, counting. The smell ebbed slightly, then steadied, like a tide finding its level. You're drifting, the voice said, not unkindly. I opened my eyes wider. fixing on the grain of the wood in front of me. The voice was closer now, more localized, as if it had chosen a position in the room. I did not look for it. "I'm awake," I said. A pause, then a soft sound, almost a chuckle. Awake is a spectrum. The clock ticked. 11:37 p.m. The tower creaked beneath me, a long groan that traveled up the supports and into the floorboards. This time, it wasn't temperature. I felt the shift through my boots, subtle but unmistakable. Weight had changed below. Not impact. Occupation. I moved to the window despite myself, peering through the narrow gap in the blinds. The lights had returned, but fewer now. Arranged in a tighter formation near the ladder. Their glow illuminated the ground in a shallow pool. Enough to reveal something new. The dirt had been smoothed. Not trampled, not disturbed, cleared. The footprints were gone, replaced by a flat, even surface, like a stage prepared between acts. My pulse spiked. The forest wasn't pressing anymore. It was preparing. I stepped back, heart racing, and sat down hard in the chair. Sitting had saved me before. I needed clarity. The guidelines had mentioned it explicitly. If disorientation occurred inside the tower, sit and wait. I clasped my hands together, anchoring myself in the sensation of skin on skin. The waiting felt different now. Not passive, expectant. At 11:49 p.m., the door handle moved. Not turning, just shifting, as if tested by a hand that knew it wouldn't open. The shadow beneath the door deepened, stretching unevenly across the floor. I did not look directly at it. I watched the clock instead, counting seconds by sound alone. Tick, tick, tick. "You can rest," the voice said softly. "We can keep watch." My eyes burned. The suggestion landed where my resistance was weakest, sliding into the fatigue that had been gnawing at me for hours. The idea of letting go, just for a moment, felt intoxicating. I imagined closing my eyes and waking to daylight. The forest returned to distance and silence. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my thumb until pain flared sharp and immediate. "No," I said. The door handle stilled. At midnight, the clock chimed once. It was not designed to do that. No alarm, no hourly signal. Just a single, clean chime that resonated through the small room and into my bones. The sound felt ceremonial, like a marker crossing. 1200 a.m. The forest responded. The lights below surged brighter, flooding the clearing in pale illumination. The darkness beyond the ring receded slightly, revealing tree trunks and undergrowth in stark detail. I could see the ladder clearly now, its rungs gleaming faintly. At the base, the ground was pristine, unmarked, waiting. The voice shifted tone. "This is the last clean moment," it said. "After this, it gets harder to tell what belongs to you." My thoughts slowed, dragging. Images pressed in unbidden. Me stepping onto the ladder. Hands cold on metal. The forest opening paths that made sense only when you followed them. The pressure in the room increased, not crushing, but guiding, like a current nudging a swimmer toward shore. I stood abruptly, breaking the flow. The pressure snapped back a fraction, enough to breathe. I turned my back on the door and walked to the center of the room, planting my feet wide, grounding myself. The tower felt smaller than ever, but it was still mine. Still inside. Still separate. "I won't integrate," I said louder now. Voice steadier. "I won't accept a role I didn't choose." The lights flickered, once, then steadied. "You chose when you came," the voice replied. "You chose when you stayed. Choice doesn't disappear because you don't like its shape." My head swam. Words tangled. I struggled to hold onto the sequence of events, to remember the order that proved continuity. Morning smoke. Missing trail. Afternoon figure. Night voices. Each memory felt like it was slipping. Edges blurring. I grabbed the logbook and read aloud from it, forcing sound into the room, reclaiming narrative. Times. Observations. My own handwriting anchored me, each word a stake driven into the night. The voice receded slightly, as if pushed back by the act of record. At 12:18 a.m., the radio came alive again, but this time without pretense. No dispatch cadence, no concern. Just my own voice. "Daniel," it said, speaking words I remembered thinking but never saying. "You're doing it wrong. You're supposed to go down before it resets." I slammed the logbook shut, breath hitching. Hearing myself reflected back, like that cracked something inside me. My voice carried certainty, impatience, familiarity. It sounded like the part of me that wanted this to end, that wanted resolution at any cost. I unplugged the radio again, yanking the cable free and tossing the unit onto the cot. The voice cut off mid-syllable. The lights dimmed. The pressure eased. I sagged against the desk, chest heaving. The forest had tried a different angle, turning my own thoughts into leverage. It hadn't worked, but it had come close, too close. At 12:32 a.m. the tower shuddered. Not a strike, not a test, a settling. Like something heavy adjusting its position beneath the structure, committing to a weight. The floor vibrated gently, continuously now. A low tremor that never quite stopped. I understood then the forest was no longer attempting quick access. It had accepted delay. It was prepared to let me erode on my own terms, to wait until exhaustion or confusion created the opening it needed. I checked the clock again, forcing my eyes to focus. 12:41 a.m. The night stretched ahead, vast and patient. Dawn felt impossibly distant, a concept rather than a certainty. My resistance had held, but it was thinning, fraying at the edges. Every minute demanded effort now, deliberate and costly. I sat down, carefully, eyes open, hands flat on the desk. I would not stand. I would not move unless I had to. Observation. Stillness. Refusal. The forest shifted below, the lights rearranging subtly, optimizing angles, refining its watch. It had learned my limits, and I had learned something worse. This place did not need me to break a rule. It only needed me to forget why I was following them. Sometime after 12:41 a.m., the night lost its shape. I do not mean that time stopped. The clock continued to move. I verified that repeatedly. Sometimes every minute, sometimes every few seconds when my thoughts began to smear together. What vanished was the sense of progression. Each moment no longer felt like it followed the one before it. They stacked instead, compressing into a single, suffocating present. 12:47 a.m. and 12:53 a.m., 1:01 a.m. I wrote each time down, my handwriting deteriorating into something tight and angular, as if I were carving the numbers rather than writing them. The act required effort now. Even lifting the pen felt deliberate, like moving against resistance. The vibration beneath the tower never stopped. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even loud. It was constant. A low-frequency reminder that something substantial had settled into place below me. Whatever it was, it had no intention of leaving. The lights remained, but they changed behavior. They no longer clustered near the ladder. They spread outward, forming a loose perimeter around the tower, each glow equidistant from the next. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. The forest was no longer focusing on entry. It was defining a boundary. I became acutely aware of the space inside the tower. Not just its size, but its limits. Where the floor ended, where the walls met, how much room there was to pace before turning around. The cabin felt smaller every time I measured it with my steps, as if the act of measuring caused it to contract. At 1:14 a.m., the overhead light dimmed, not flickering, fading. I held my breath, waiting for it to cut out entirely, but it stabilized at a lower level, casting longer, harsher shadows across the room. Corners deepened into pockets of darkness that seemed to drink in what little light remained. I adjusted the lamp on the desk, angling it carefully to eliminate blind spots. The shadows adjusted with it. That was when I realized I was no longer alone inside the room. Not physically, not in the way a person occupies space, but the sense of presence had crossed the threshold. The forest no longer felt like it was pressing from outside. It felt like it was sharing the interior with me, occupying the negative space between objects, the air itself. "You're holding on to sequence," the voice said, closer than it had ever been. "That's good. Sequence matters." I did not answer. My throat felt tight, raw from hours of controlled breathing and half-swallowed panic. "But sequence isn't the same as direction," it continued. "You can move forward and still go nowhere." The clock ticked loudly. 1:22 a.m. I felt the urge to check the windows again, to confirm that the forest still looked like a forest. The impulse was strong, nearly overwhelming. My body leaned before my mind caught up. I stopped myself halfway, hands gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles ached. Looking felt dangerous now. Not because I would see something new, but because I might see something familiar in a way that invited reinterpretation. Instead, I closed my eyes. The guidelines had not forbidden that. They had warned about sensors and reactions, but none of those applied here. Closing my eyes felt like reclaiming one variable, one small piece of control. The darkness behind my eyelids was immediate and thick. Images surfaced at once. Not the invasive impressions from earlier, but something more structured. Scenes arranged with intent. The tower, seen from below. The ladder rising into shadow. A figure standing where I knew the door should be, watching. I opened my eyes with a gasp. The room was unchanged. I laughed quietly, the sound brittle. Exhaustion was catching up to me, reshaping fear into something less sharp but more dangerous. Doubt. Second-guessing. The creeping thought that maybe the forest wasn't lying. At 1:37 a.m., the vibration beneath the tower shifted. It didn't stop. It changed rhythm. Slower. Heavier. Like something repositioning itself for comfort. The metal supports groaned in response. The sound deep and resonant. I felt it through the soles of my boots, up my spine, into my teeth. The pressure in the room increased again. Not all at once, but incrementally, like a dimmer switch being turned by an unseen hand. Breathing required more effort. My chest felt tight, compressed. "You're nearing the limit of refusal," the voice said. It was not a threat. It was an observation. That's not a failure. It's a function. I pressed my palms flat against the desk, grounding myself in texture and temperature. "What happens if I pass it?" I asked. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Silence followed. The pressure spiked sharply, enough to make me gasp. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. I cursed myself, clamping my mouth shut, furious at the slip. Engagement. Response. I had granted something, even if I didn't know what. The voice returned, closer now, almost intimate. "Then you stopped needing to decide." My stomach dropped. At 1:52 a.m., the clock skipped forward. Not a second. A minute. I stared at it. Heart pounding, watching the hands settle into their new position. I checked my logbook, comparing timestamps. The gap was undeniable. Time had jumped. Disorientation. The guidelines' words echoed in my head, sharp and clear despite the fog creeping into my thoughts. Partial compliance results in disorientation, repetition, or loss. This was the cost of the question I had asked. I sat down hard in the chair, forcing myself into stillness. Sitting had been the prescribed response to internal disorientation. I clung to that rule like a lifeline, trusting it more than my own instincts. The pressure eased slightly. Outside, the lights dimmed in response. As if acknowledging the correction, I breathed slowly, deliberately, counting each inhale and exhale. In, out. In, out. My thoughts slowed, then steadied, aligning themselves again around the ticking of the clock. 2003 a.m. time moved. Barely, but it moved. I understood then that the forest wasn't trying to rush me anymore. It didn't need to. The longer I stayed awake, the more likely I was to create my own opening. A question, a glance, a misstep born of fatigue. The role it wanted me to accept wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't symbolic. It was practical. To be here without resisting. To stop distinguishing between observation and participation. At 20:11 a.m., the door creaked softly. Not opening, not unlocking. Just a sound of pressure easing, like something leaning against it from the other side, and then pulling away. The message was clear enough. The barrier was negotiable. I did not look at it. I stared at the clock, at the logbook, at my own shaking hands. I focused on anything that reminded me I was still me, still separate. The vibration beneath the tower slowed again, then settled into a near constant hum. The forest had found a rhythm it liked. It was willing to maintain it as long as I remained inside that rhythm with it. 24 a.m. My vision blurred at the edges. Not from darkness, but from fatigue. The room seemed to tilt slightly, reality losing its rigidity. I blinked hard, fighting it. But my body was reaching the end of what adrenaline could sustain. I realized with sudden clarity that dawn was still hours away, and that the forest knew exactly how long I could last. It didn't need me to step outside anymore. It just needed me to stop insisting that I was inside. I do not remember deciding to stand. I remember the sensation of my legs locking, the pressure in my chest easing just enough to allow movement, and the thought, quiet, reasonable, dangerous, that sitting had begun to feel like waiting for permission. The clock said 7:37 a.m. I wrote it down automatically, even as the numbers felt less anchored than they had an hour ago. The vibration beneath the tower had softened into something almost gentle. Not a hum anymore. A presence at rest. The lights outside dimmed further, their perimeter loosening, as if the forest were relaxing its posture. It was no longer testing. It was observing outcome. I stood in the center of the room, arms hanging at my sides, breathing shallowly. The exhaustion had moved beyond pain. It had entered a numb, cooperative phase where thoughts came without resistance. That frightened me more than anything that had happened earlier. The voice did not speak. It did not need to. At 2:49 a.m., the clock advanced normally. I felt a surge of relief disproportionate to the event. Time still obeyed rules. That meant something still mattered. I clung to that idea, repeating it silently like a mantra, even as the edges of my awareness began to fray. I walked to the windows. Not all the way. Just close enough to adjust the blinds a fraction, letting in a sliver of the outside world. The forest looked unchanged at first glance. Still, empty. The lights were almost gone now. reduced to faint embers scattered far from the tower, barely visible unless I strained to see them. I stopped straining. The realization came quietly, without drama. The forest was not asking anymore. It was waiting for alignment. I stepped back from the window and turned toward the desk, tending to sit again, to reassert stillness before something irreversible happened. That was when I noticed the logbook. It was open. I was certain I had closed it earlier. The page displayed handwriting that matched mine in shape and pressure, but the content was wrong. The times were wrong. They repeated in clusters. Once in 52M appeared 3 times in a row. 3M twice. Between them were notes I did not remember writing. Observations phrased in language I would not have chosen. Boundary stable. Observation consistent. Subject remains cooperative. My stomach turned. I flicked backward through the pages. The earlier entries were intact. Familiar. Mine. But somewhere after midnight, the handwriting began to change subtly, strokes smoothing out, spacing becoming more uniform. The words grew clinical, detached. The forest had not needed me to leave. It had started rewriting the part of me that stayed. At 3:11 a.m., the pressure lifted almost entirely. The absence of it was startling, like the sudden quiet after machinery shuts down. My ears rang. My body swayed slightly as my balance adjusted. I realized I could breathe deeply again. Fully, comfortably. That comfort was the final warning. I stepped away from the desk and forced myself toward the cot, sitting hard on the edge. Sitting had always pulled me back. It grounded me. This time, it felt optional. The voice returned, softer than ever. "You're doing fine," it said. "You've already adapted." I shook my head weakly. I didn't agree. There was no immediate response. The forest had learned patience better than I ever could. Outside, something changed. Not the lights. Not the clearing. The sky. The blackness above the canopy thinned almost imperceptibly, the stars fading one by one as the horizon began to pale. Dawn was coming. Actual dawn. The realization cut through the fog in my head like cold water. I lurched to my feet and stumbled to the window. Ignoring the rules for the first time with intention, I opened the blinds fully. The forest did not react. The trees stood as they always had. Tall, silent, empty, no figures, no movement, no lights. The clearing below was bare dirt and leaf litter, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever circled the tower at all. The clock read 4:02 a.m. Time surged forward now, minute by minute, reclaiming its pace. My head cleared in painful increments, awareness snapping back into place with each passing second. The pressure did not return. The voice did not speak again. By 4:19 a.m., the sky was unmistakably lighter. Birdsong began hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Wind moved through the canopy in familiar, chaotic patterns. The tower creaked as it always had at dawn, metal warming, joints loosening. Normal sounds. Normal forest. I sagged against the window frame, shaking, exhaustion crashing over me all at once. I stayed there until full daylight washed the trees in muted gold and green, until I could convince myself that I was truly alone again. When the morning check-in came through the radio at 6:00 a.m., I answered. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears. Too steady. Too calm. "Tower 17, I said. "All clear. No incidents to report." The words tasted like ash. They pulled me off the tower before noon. "Routine rotation," they said. No explanation. No questions. The supplemental guidelines were gone from the packet when I packed my things. I searched for them twice, convinced I had misplaced them. until I realized the edges of the memory itself felt smoothed over. Weeks have passed since that day. I still wake up before dawn, heart racing, convinced I've missed a shift change. I still write times down obsessively, especially when I'm tired. Sometimes, when I reread what I've written, the phrasing feels unfamiliar, efficient, detached. And sometimes when I'm very still, I feel that same gentle pressure settle over me, not demanding, not threatening, observant. The forest did not take me. It did something quieter. It taught me how easy it is to stay,